everyone should want to have Jody Button introduce them, I should say. Thank you so much. And it is such a pleasure to be in this room with all of you this morning. I've been getting around and visiting with a few people that I had the pleasure to meet. Of course, it was a delight to get to meet Alma Jacobs, and I can't wait to hear more from her. But I also talked to Carol Majinga and Ellen Funk and Dr. Booker, and I know that I am in the presence of people who are new to the nonprofit world and people who have given their lives in service. And so it is a wonderful room to be in this morning. It truly makes me grateful and proud. You're going to hear me talk about a lot of women that I love. People in my family, women I have worked with over time. But I want to first start with two women who gave me some advice this morning. One of them is my daughter, Katie. She just graduated from Pitt Law. She passed the bar this summer, and she is working as an attorney. And I called her and I said, Katie, what do I wear for this august occasion that I have? She said, well, Mama, I advise you to go bold. I think animal print is the thing. So here I am. And you will also hear more of the work of Carrie Tancrader, who has been the chief researcher on this project. And I went into her office yesterday morning because I have the privilege to work with her daily. And I said, Carrie, what do I need to tell him? And she said, you know what my doctoral dissertation is really talking about? It's about confidence. So I come to you this morning confident that this is an important topic that we have to talk about, and equally confident that you are the right people to be in this room for this topic this morning. It is a privilege to be here. So a few ground rules. We are allowing for some Q&A at the end, but if you have a burning question, or I am a devotee of Peter Drucker, and Drucker teaches a principle of constructive dissent. So this is not delivered wisdom on stone tablets. This is a conversation about why is this still true in 2014, and what can each one of us do about it? So if you have a question and we're rolling and you'd like to ask it in the middle of my conversation, you go right ahead. Just as Jody said, get your coffee and your water, but I'm a person who likes dialogue, and I'm very interested in what other people are thinking. So if you've got a question in the midst, go ahead. I'll take it if I can. We'll try not to go down a rabbit hole because I have a lot to tell you. But we also will have a little bit of time at the end, so if you want to make a note of a question, that's good. I believe in constructive dissent. As I said, I don't think this is delivered wisdom. I think this is hard thought and carefully considered, but each of you has your own life experience that may say something different. And then I want you to hold this question in your mind throughout the day, and that is, what can I do to affect positive change on this issue? What can I do tomorrow morning? So how did this all get started? In the 80s, I worked for a community art museum in Austin, Texas, and I worked with a woman named Judith, who was the director of our art school. Judith was a fabulous director of the art school. She brought thousands of people to enjoy themselves in the arts. She was a single woman, and at the time I was hired, I was paid $10,000 a year. So I think Judith was probably making about $17,500. She stayed at that art museum for 35 years, leading the art school and making possibilities for the people. By staying, she did not move and increase her salary. She took those marvelous raises that we get in nonprofits of 2% a year. And I began to worry about Judith in the 80s because they took our pensions away at one point when we had a hard time financially. They said, oops, this year we can't do pension matching, and so we won't. And that happened periodically. And ever since the 80s, I've been wondering what was going to happen to Judith when she retired as a single woman on an arts salary in Austin, Texas. And I began to be concerned that we were going to have a lot of women who had given their lives to the community in excellent service, who were not going to have literally money to eat more than beans. And so I began to think about this when I was pretty young. But the years passed and I was busy. And we began to do a wage and benefit study in the year 2000, commissioned by our United Way. Kind of an interesting thing. There was a committee of us who came together to put the questions on the wage and benefit study together to work with our consultants. And some of the people on the committee were totally opposed to having any questions that related to race or gender as part of the wage and benefit study. And a wonderful scholar in our community, Dr. Kevin Kearns, said, "I will not put my name on this survey if it does not measure gender and racial differences in salary." This was the first time in our region that anybody had asked those questions. And oh my goodness, what did we find? In the year 2000, it was 67 cents on the dollar for a woman executive director and leading the same sized organization as a man. And it caught the attention of the press. In fact, we do it every other year. It's in process right now. And every year, the press had something to say about the wage gap in nonprofits. Finally, in about 2008, the Post-Gazette wrote an editorial, and they said, "What's this about? Isn't this supposed to be the social justice sector? How is this still true in the nonprofit sector?" And I was stung, because I've been a feminist since I was a little girl. When I was 10 years old, I wanted to be president of the United States, no joke. And I was lucky to be in a family who didn't laugh at me. A lot of people laughed. A lot of people teased my parents about their silly daughter, but my parents didn't laugh at me. And yet I had been reporting this injustice since the year 2000, and I had not taken it on. So I decided a couple of things. I told you about Katie and Carrie. There's another Carrie, and there's a Cindy, and there's a bunch of people that I really value, younger women. And I thought, I do not want to spend my whole life working to see that nonprofits are effective and efficient and never ask if they're fair. And so we began to ask the question. And I turned 60. Now those are, oops. Oh, I dropped it. Well, and now I've knocked it off. So let's see. Okay. I turned 60, and although I intend to work until I'm fully 70, we all know about the IRS and the Social Security benefit there. Still, when you turn 60, you have to know that you aren't going to work forever. And this question became particularly urgent to me. And so I went to the funder in our community, the Eden Hall Foundation. It's H.J. Heinz money, and if you don't know, H.J. Heinz had a retreat center for his line employees in the 30s called Eden Hall Farm. So they're one of the few that really fund women's issues generously. And they did indeed, after many months of conversation, decide that a full-blown research project was deserving of a $250,000 research grant. So you are here to hear the results of a significant investment of both money and time. That was a 3-year project. Some of you have already mentioned the fact that 74% is an arbitrary figure. It happens to be accurate from our wage and benefit study, and the percentage of the workforce is 74%. And so it was good. These numbers move around a bit, just as you said earlier. They move around. The national average is 78%. In your region, it might be 75% or 72% or 80%. But the fact of the matter is that the injustice is permanent. And we were lucky to also attract funding from the Bear Foundation and also a local firm there. And we began to do the research. But what we really were trying to do, and why I'm so delighted to be here today, was build a movement. So I've carried a question these past few years of how do we move past research and dialogue to building a shared community-owned movement. How do we find our allies, and how do we equip them with solid information and a strong sense of community that moves people to action? Alma said it, I say it again, moves people to action. Talking and thinking and acting to see that pay equity in the social justice sector is embraced. And that all this societal weirdness about money and value and personal worthiness has made these decisions so hidden that we really need to see that this truth of fairness is what makes us, what motivates us and moves us forward. And then the thing that I really want to say, some of you have already told me you're a consultant to boards of directors. I know the MCCF board is here in force. That's really where this needs to be. That's where the conversation needs to go. So I want to say to people who serve on boards and people who are staff of nonprofits that what I hope is going to happen is that we are going to be as proud of the way people are treated inside our organizations as we are of the way they are treated by our organizations, and have that conversation, and to move past what feels to me increasingly like an inherent lack of respect for the work of the nonprofit sector, as evidenced by this pay equity issue. So we did a number of things to try to understand this better. I'm going to tell you some more about some of the things we learned from, I did 66 personal interviews. They were delightful. I got to spend an hour and a half with 66 women and men who telling me their life story and asking them questions about how they had proceeded with their jobs, what their family's influence was on them, what they did. My son told me that I couldn't ask people what gave them joy. I think he thought it was a little racy, but I said, yes, I can, and yes, I did, and I heard wonderful things that gave people joy. I also heard people talking about retirement, and we're going to talk about that more. We did focus groups. We are very convivial at the Bear Center, and so we had teas, and we had brown bags, and we had board members come, and we had young professionals come, and women facing retirement come, and all kinds of people came and talked to us about these issues. And we also did literature review, and this is kind of interesting because I was given a book called Women in Power in the Nonprofit Sector, which is, as we can find at this date, the only book that was published that is solely about women's role in the nonprofit sector, and it was published in 1992. It was a collection of findings from a conference at the University of San Francisco in 1992. We brought the editor as part of this work, and she has encouraged us to write the next book, and that is our strong hope. But can you believe that it's going to be over 20 years before this topic is retaken? So a little bit of background about why this is. So let's look at this slide. This one says that the women entered the workforce, and the buttons in the back I can't wait to look at, because women entered the workforce in big numbers in the early 1970s. And the growth in the number of nonprofit organizations, as you can see, there's a very clear line between women coming in and nonprofit numbers accelerating. It's the boomers at work. Here we are. If you look at the division of the workforce by sector, you see that the private workforce is about 2/3 men, and the public workforce is about equally divided between men and women, and the nonprofit sector is about 3/4 women. So we have two gendered sectors up there, don't we? The private sector remains gendered. It remains very much a province of men. But what's happening in the private sector is an enormous respect for the contributions of women. You know, I'm sure you all have heard the joke that if it was Lehman Sisters instead of Lehman Brothers, we might have had a different 2008. So there's been a lot of work done in the corporate world to recognize that women contribute to profitability, that they are part of what makes business strong and effective. And so that gendered sector is making strides. In our gendered sector, many of us have lamented over the years that the nonprofit sector has had an ineffective voice in public policy all too often. That we haven't had a place at the table, whatever that means to you, all too often. That we see too few women as elected officials, all too often. And the list goes on. And I believe that it is in part because we have a gendered sector. It is a woman-gendered sector, and we have never talked about it like that. So you can see that we also were looking at the disparity between the best paid person and the normal person in that, and we can see that government is the fairest payer of people. I believe that has to do with merit exams and merit increases. They're the worst paid of people, that's true as well. But at any rate, there's less disparity between the top paid person and the next paid person. And of course, we've had a long conversation in our society about executive pay in the private sector. I think we need to have a conversation about executive pay in the nonprofit sector because there is some disparity there that I would prefer to see different. But we're here to talk about women's earning power. And the way in which we found this information out was through 990 research. So I mentioned Carrie Tancrader. She had to take motion sickness pills from scrolling through the 990s. She has now read and studied well over 500 990s. And all of you know the 990 form is the tax information form for nonprofits. It is posted to the web at GuideStar and many other places. And so I will stand on our research absolutely firmly because I know Carrie. And when we talk about the role of the board chair by gender, she personally Googled every single board chair to make sure who was a man and who was a woman. And out of the 990 research, so I say this to you because this was not data mining. This was not done by a machine that was cherry picking. This was us. We went to the National Center for Charitable Statistics. We separated the regional nonprofits. We left out hospitals and universities because we thought that would skew the results. And we came up with something we called programmatic nonprofits. There is really no such thing, but you know what we're saying. We're saying that's health and human services, that's arts and culture, that's environmental groups, that's the nonprofit sector as we know it. And in Pittsburgh, there are 107 organizations that have annual operating budgets in excess of $7 million a year, and so those are the large. We also looked at a sample of mid-sized organizations that have budgets of $1 to $7 million a year, and those are the mid-sized. The small are budgets less than $1 million a year, and I imagine most of you know in this room that over 90% of nonprofits are small, which is another part of our story here, is it not? But this is how it works out. So the executive position is paid differently in different sized organizations as well. We were very fortunate in this work to have lots of friends, and one of them is the Institute for, I always get their name, Women's Policy, the Institute for Women's Policy Research in Washington, D.C. They are really the mothership of pay equity research. They've been doing it for 25 years across many different sectors, and they taught me a lot of things that we needed to know. So one of them was that they, of course, have the women's real wages across all of society are 77% of men's. Everyone has been flat since 2008. We're beginning to see upticks, and you're beginning to hear that things are getting better. But women's were rising faster than men's from the 70s to the 90s. We were seeing real gains in women's equity. And then they flattened out about 10 or 15 years ago. And that's what led Sheryl Sandberg to write Lean In. And that's why this issue, I think, has come back to the fore, was we were seeing real progress and then it disappeared. And so there were two key facts that they told us that, when you said you were a little nauseous, some of this is nauseous inducing. Here's another couple. So, two key facts. At the present rate of improvement, it will be 2057 before there is pay equity for women in the United States of America. I will be 107 years old before there is pay equity for women in America. And yet, it will be 2021 before there is equality in Congress of women leaders. And they said, vote with your purse, ladies, because women's political contributions are currently only 26% of all political contributions. So we need to be active in lots of different ways. But the depth of this challenge is quite real, and you can see it in many, many different kinds of statistics. So remember that we are looking at roughly 350 local nonprofits selected. And we found that in the small organizations, 2/3, and again, below $1 million a year, 2/3 of the executive jobs are held by women. In the mid-sized nonprofits, it's about half and half. And when you get to the large nonprofits, read prestigious, read asked to be on panels and be speaking on behalf of the nonprofit sector, only 1/3 of those jobs are held by women. So the inequity is not just about pay, it's about access to power. We were also deeply curious about how the gender of the board chair affected these statistics. And we found that men hold the majority of the board chairs in all sized organizations. In smaller organizations, about a third are women leaders. In mid-sized, it's about a quarter, and about a quarter in the very large as well. So this is also an important part of the issue. So what does this mean? This means that I wanted to know if having a woman board chair made a difference in the way women were paid. And unfortunately, I don't have this slide, so please listen to me and ask any questions if I'm not being clear, because this is the money slide, ladies and gentlemen. So, if you are a man and you have a man as your board chair in a large organization in our region, your average pay was $284,971. If you are a woman and you have a woman as your board chair, leading the same sized organization, your pay was $132,355. Now that math means that you are advantaged $150,000 a year if you are a man with a man as your board chair. This is the classic Pogo cartoon. We have met the enemy, and it is us. Why in the world would women board chairs not be advocating for their women staff in the way that men board chairs are advocating for their staff? Because, by the way, you want a man as your board chair. When it comes to compensation, men are more generous. Now, how many of you all have sat in one of these meetings where they're having a discussion about what people should be paid and heard a man say, "He's really good. We're all pleased with him, aren't we? Yeah, he's great. Well, he might leave us if we don't pay him well, so I think we ought to give him a raise of," and they put a number on the table that gets your attention. And you know, they said, I've been board chair now of 9 different nonprofit organizations, and I hang my head in holy shame to remember similar conversations where I was taking the temperature of the group, trying to check and see that no one was upset, trying to make sure that we were coming up with something that everyone could support, being totally consensual and totally involved, and never taking a leadership stand to say, for heaven's sake, we need to pay this person well. They're doing a good job for us. If you look at the size difference between the mid-sized and the small in this way, there's a 65% difference in the large, and there's about a 50% difference in the small and the medium-sized. So this is a persistent problem that the gender of the board chair does not lead to equity. In fact, it deepens the inequity. And we had our speakers talk to us a little bit about this dismal slide. Happy holidays, y'all. So women who get a doctorate have to work almost as, make just a little bit more than men with a bachelor's. So we have all been very excited about more women. And as was pointed out, you know, college graduations and advanced degree graduations are tipping in favor of women. And we've talked about the value of education. It's the American dream. But we haven't gotten there yet because it hasn't translated into the kinds of gains that we would have hoped to have seen for equipping yourself more intentionally. But I believe that we need to build a bigger tent. And so this conversation is not solely about women's pay. It's also about the lost wages for men who work in female-dominated jobs. This also is from the Women's Institute for Policy, and it shows that women in female-dominated jobs lose on average about $3,400 a year. Men in female-dominated jobs lose about $6,259 a year. It amounts to $114 billion in lost wages. So this is not a women's issue. Of course, it is a women's issue, but it is not solely a women's issue. This is a personal issue, and it's a deeply important issue right now for the nonprofit sector as we watch baby boomers turn 65 at the rate of 10,000 a day, and there's a sea change of leadership that is happening and coming and will continue to come for the next 10 years. So as I'm sure is quite evident, I'm an aging hippie. My politics were forged in the anti-war movement, and boy, did I learn a lot from the anti-war movement. Those of you who were there remember women didn't exactly thrive. We did a lot of catching of coffee and doing that kind of thing in the anti-war movement. And I told you that we're really interested in building a movement, and so what does it take to build a movement? So I thought about the movement that I'd been in as a young woman, and I thought, what did I learn? Well, I learned a few things. Don't be arrogant. We were arrogant in the anti-war movement. We separated ourselves from the soldiers and held ourselves as better than. And that was a huge mistake, which fortunately we're not recreating now. So don't leave most of the people out from inclusion in your tribe. There are a lot of fair-minded people who can hear a strong argument and be swayed by it. Extend your compassion to those who are bearing the brunt of public policy. As I said, value the sacrifice of the soldiers. So how can we, in the 74%, put the lessons and those disappointments and others that we learned from the women's movement to work for 74% and fare better this time? That's the quantitative research that we did, you've seen, and that's very compelling. We also did qualitative research, and I did, as I mentioned to you all, 66 interviews. I talked to executive directors, foundation professionals, corporate leaders. I talked to people who led organizations ranging in size from a global corporation to a $32 million nonprofit to a brand new $220,000 nonprofit. I talked to women who disclosed their salaries to me from $36,000 a year to well over $100,000 a year. There were people in their 20s right through to their 70s. I talked to a diversity of people of different races, of different job types, of different lenses, if you will, because we wanted to have a picture of the whole. And all of these interviews were recorded and all of them were transcribed. More about that later. You're going to see a little bit of what we did with them after I conclude. And out of all of those interviews, we distilled it down to some key messages. And the first was, it chose me. So my very first question to people was, why did you choose nonprofit work? And to an eerie effect, about 2/3 of them responded, it chose me. I didn't choose it. This is a quote. I mean, I've never been a person who could simply read about problems. I had to jump in and try to solve them. And as I thought about this, it chose me, I thought about the sense of calling that is implicit in those words. I have worked my whole life, as Joni told you, as a management consultant and a director of programs to build capacity in nonprofit organizations. I've spent a lot of time trying to help people get their budgets in order, get their marketing plans made, get their board's governance principles to be accurate and up to date, all of these things to professionalize the nonprofit sector. And in my case, it was to see that nonprofits thrived and were taken seriously and the work was respected. That's all good. But have we, as we have striven so hard to make nonprofits more professional, have we been leeching the soul out of nonprofits by not honoring that sense of calling and by not owning the fact that people are living their values when they work in nonprofit organizations and that this is a tremendous asset for us? So one of the findings and one of the things I'm going to be writing op-eds about, etc., is this sense of calling. It chose me. Jody asked me last night if I had liked my work. And I said, you know, there's never a day that I felt like I didn't need to go to work. I mean, it's not that every day was good by no matter of means, frustrations and disappointments and anger and all the things that the flesh is heir to. But because I've worked in the nonprofit sector all of my life, I knew I needed to get to work that day, and I needed to try to be present and helpful because that was my job. And that's what I see all around me in the nonprofit sector. People who just show up and give it their best and try as hard as they can because they can't do anything else. It's their calling. The perils of youth. So, I also asked specific questions about race and gender discrimination. Can you tell me a time when you felt discriminated against because of your race or your gender? And many of the younger women who were responding to my questions could cite incidences of racial and gender discrimination, but what they were far more worried about was age discrimination. There was a general sense of condescension toward the young. They felt discounted, dismissed, and patted on the head. I've talked to you about my wonderful Carrie Tancrader and how bright she is and how she's a doctoral candidate and how she's done all this wonderful research. I didn't also tell you that she's really pretty. She has long blonde hair and snapping blue eyes, and she's just as cute as she can be. She was a ballerina in her youth. And so after I did a number of these interviews with these younger women, and I was hearing these stories of how they had felt discounted and unwelcome, I went back to her and said, and it's even worse if you're cute, isn't it, Carrie? You can't have a brain in your head. And she said, welcome to my world. Oh, come on. It's 2014. Is this what we were trying to build when we were working in the 1970s? Another quote from my interviews. When I started off, it took me a lot of years to build up confidence. I always felt I was being discriminated against because of my age. You start thinking you are not capable. This is by a senior corporate officer in Pittsburgh today. So, we really have to start thinking about how we encourage and build confidence, capability, and give younger women chances to lead, because boy, are we going to need them in 10 years. And so then when I talked to women in their 30s and 40s, there was another theme that came throughout these interviews. And it was this, I feel stuck. Now, I would imagine that many of you in this room, having lived since 2008 in an economy that has been uncertain, seems to be improving now, and we can celebrate that. But for many, for the last 5 years, we lived through great uncertainty of times. I would think that some of us could resonate with this, I feel stuck. But when I started hearing in my interviews from women 20 and 30 years younger than I began to think about what was different for them than what had been true for my own life. So I worked for 7 years at that art museum with Judith, and I had a wonderful experience there. My children were welcome in that environment, and I loved the museum. But we were going to build a new museum, and it never got built. And so the career ladder, isn't that a funny term to put into most nonprofit organizations? We don't have one, but there was no career ladder because the new museum was not built. And so there was really no place for me to go. And so I decided after much thought that I needed to leave. I needed to get a different job. And in about 2 months, I had a different job. Now, I hope and believe I was employable, but it wasn't about that. It was about the sense that there was ferment and opportunity and new things happening and new jobs opening. And so the way women built their careers in nonprofits was to move. We learned what we could. We got the benefit of the salary, the benefits, and the experience in one place. And then when we felt like we'd done that, we got a different job. And I would predict, if I could ask a number of you all in this room, that you worked places and then you moved. And then you got a good job there and then you moved. And so you improved your salary and your opportunities, your responsibilities through movement. If you think about what has happened in our society recently, you know that there has been much discussion about the overhead question in nonprofits. What is the proper amount of overhead for a nonprofit? So paying people fairly has not been much about what we've been talking about, but rather controlling costs down to the nubbin. We also have not been characterized by HR that has much professional development. Again, through my corporate friends, I am exposed to training programs that they bring young people into the corporation, and they immediately start assessing them for leadership capabilities by moving them through different parts of the business to see where they're particularly good and assigning them mentors and doing all manner of things so they are building their pipeline. I have not seen much of that in most nonprofits. Once again, we have 10 or fewer employees. We're doing well to get the door open and the children on the school bus, much less trying to figure out how we can develop our younger employees. But we are going to reap the whirlwind on this one if we don't get better at professional development. And part of the reason here is those of us who are boomers in this room have capped the possibilities for younger people by not changing jobs. So no surprises here that the rate of mobility has dropped dramatically in the last 5 years. Many people have been holding on by their fingernails, very glad to have a job, and are certainly not going to rock the boat. Now it's getting interesting, isn't it? Because things are really getting better, and the job market is opening up, and I'm going to be really watching this with some complete interest. But nonetheless, if you work in higher education, and I know we have some exemplary people here from the community college, we've been hearing this problem about tenured professors who stay on into their 80s and make it impossible for younger academics to progress. So they're teaching adjunct classes. Well, we have a similar analogy in nonprofits too, where we have long tenured executive directors who are sitting at the top of their organizations and not allowing for much movement. There's a McKinsey study that has just come out about professional development in nonprofits where they speak to this, how there's no bench in nonprofits. They use the phrase, we don't have a C-suite. That amused me. You know, the C-suite is the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the chief information officer. And of course, in most nonprofits, that's all the same person. So this lack of mobility by older women means that the way some of us built our careers is much less possible for younger women. And yet I say again to you, baby boomers are turning 65 at the rate of 10,000 a day, and although we are Peter Pan and we really do plan to live forever, we in fact will not. And so what are we doing to see that those capable young women who have been discounted and cast aside all too often are being deliberately and intentionally groomed to lead the organizations that we must have to have the society in which we wish to live? So we talked a bit with these younger nonprofit women, and we found that, no surprises here, they also thought that in many cases, executive director jobs looked like hell. So you know, who wants that was sort of so we've got a lot of work to do to make our jobs more attractive, to make our jobs more doable. I think we have work to do to think about better part-time positions. In our wage and benefit study, one of the things that we have learned is that nonprofits use part-time positions less often than for-profits do. And of course, in many cases in for-profits, those are not very good jobs. And I'm talking about really good part-time jobs where older women can continue to be viable, be engaged, offer their wisdom, which we have a lot, of course, and get some money so they can afford to live in retirement. And younger women who may be wanting to go to school or raise children or whatever can also be building their career at the same time without it being this relentless assumption that you're going to work 50 or 60 hours a week or you're a piker, right? So for younger professional women, there's a number of different things that need to be happening. And mentoring, deliberate discussion about what you did to build your own career, if it's your career for them, listening to what their concerns are. I had one young woman I was talking to tell me she didn't even know she had gotten a raise. She got her paycheck and she said, this is wrong. And she took it to the bookkeeper and said, this is wrong. And they said, oh no, you got a raise. Her boss was so unwilling to give feedback that she couldn't even tell her she was doing a good job, much less not the job that she wanted her to do. So there is a lot that has to happen here in terms of HR practice and the way in which we regard the asset, which is our staffs, in organizations. And I also want to say that, you know, sometimes these conversations are challenged by people of goodwill and people of good sense, who say, I really don't think there is a wage gap. It can be controlled by whether a woman decided to stay home with a child, or it can be controlled by when she entered the workforce, or by what her educational attainment is, or whatever. And so I say to you that if you control for absolutely every factor that you possibly can, there is at least a 7% difference. And it starts when women come out of college and they never catch up. So younger women may need to be persuaded in some cases that this is still a problem, or that this won't happen to me. but they are still caught in this spiral. And we need to be much better about talking with them about career choices and how to manage their boss and how to be visible and confident without being unlikable. We also, of course, as I've told you, I've held a concern in my mind about retirement for older women throughout this process. And we are indebted to a number of different studies that we have used as part of our work. One of them is called The Departing. Some of you all may follow Jan Masoka. She's Blue Avocado, and she also is the head of the California Association of Nonprofits, and she was the director of Compass Point for many years. I think she may be the smartest woman working in nonprofit management today. So she did this report called The Departing, and she worked also with a group called Building Movement, and they found that 77% of leaders in nonprofits who are thinking about retirement worry that their organization will literally die when they leave. Now, this is a realistic fear based on what I just was talking to you about the lack of professional development, the lack of a bench. We all know that fundraising in Pittsburgh, one of our biggest foundation people, when I asked him how they made decisions, he said, "Peggy, we back a horse." Well, that horse has a name and a face, and when that horse goes into retirement, that organization may have real money troubles because they don't have the relationships, because they haven't made a smooth transition from one leader to the next. But it also may be a little bit of pomposity on our part, thinking that, the earth rises and sets when the earth cooled and I was born, sort of syndrome. But nonetheless, about 3/4 of people think their organization is just going to go away. The other thing that's very interesting about this is 95% reject a traditional golden years retirement vision. So people who are working in nonprofits both realize they're going to have to continue work in some fashion or another, but they also have been driven by a generative spirit that said they had work to do in the community, and they intend to continue to do work in the community. One of the other speakers we brought in, as we've done the 74%, was a woman named Betsy Worley, who works for Encore.org. Some of you all may have been following this movement that says that some corporate people in their 50s and 60s, look at the nonprofit world and realize that they are very strongly drawn to trying to have the last job of their career be in a nonprofit. Maybe start one, maybe work at one. And so there is a movement abroad that corporate people are moving into nonprofit work. This is a great thing. They bring a lot of skills and abilities that we can use, and we bring a lot of meaning, fun, and liveliness to them. So this is great. But what we don't find is that people who work in nonprofits are thinking they're going to go to work in corporations or in business. And then we did some studies, and I'm sure all of you all have your own set of studies about what you need in retirement. But we found that we're being told that we need to replace 126% of our salary, in other words, a quarter more than we're making now, because of healthcare costs that they anticipate are going to go. And most people are on track to replace about 2/3 of what we're making now. So the issues around retirement, and we asked questions. I'm very interested that the financial planner was here to talk to us, because we asked questions about, do you get advice? Those of you who have any kind of retirement savings, does your organization provide opportunities for you to better understand what your choices are? And in many, many cases, in organizations of 10 or fewer employees, those discussions were never occurring. And so the whole denial, and not a river in Egypt, but denial of what this is actually going to mean is widespread, I think, in society, but it is equally widespread in nonprofit organizations. And so through your work here in Montgomery County, I know that there's some talk about mentoring and career development and those kinds of things. There also needs to be a track about what does retirement look like? How do we think about using the talent that we have in the boomer generation? How do we put them to work in meaningful ways? And how do we assure that they can lead decent lives? So we got to talking about a career path, and you have at your places a packet of materials that we provided to you. That's the different pieces of research that we have we have published. And in one of those, and actually I think in two of them, you could see this slide that's called the female career path a lot better than you can probably see it on this screen. Sorry, it's difficult to read. But we got really interested in sort of trying to figure out, if we're talking about young professionals and mid-career professionals and older professionals, what does a career path in nonprofit look like, and does it differ from the kind of career path arcs that we have been taught? So I don't know about you, but I was always taught that, people came into their career in their mid to late 20s, and they kind of peaked at about 55, maybe 60, and then they spent maybe 5 to 10 years kind of doing that generative work of building the bench, etc. But I came to believe that that career path was more modeled on men's lives than on women's, just as they tell us that heart disease research has been modeled more on men's hearts than women's hearts. Because when you talk about the pay equity issue and what has changed women's competitiveness, if you will, we often talk about the fact that they take time out of the workforce, or they step back from full engagement while they are raising young children, or while they are going to school, or doing some other kinds of self-improving kinds of things. And what that means, and what I've observed in my own life and in other lives, is that when those kids are raised, all of a sudden you're about 50 years old and you're ready to go big time into working. Now you can travel. Now you can stay late. Now you can go and be available for a Saturday meeting. Now you can do all of those things that you've been interested in doing, that you were choosing other things, and I don't regret a moment. My son Ross will be 40 in January, and he is a winemaker in Sonoma, California, and I've already told you about Katie. They are the proudest accomplishments of my life. But nonetheless, when they were little, I was a soccer mom like everybody else, and I was, engaged in making sure that they were being able to get their things, and I wasn't taking trips, and I wasn't doing things. And I think that is true for many women, and what you see on this is that what that does, though, is that if you don't really get around to trying to actively build your career until you're about 50 years old, you're going to be spending time in very self-interested, not in a negative way, but self-interested activity at the time that we've been taught people are building their bench. And so I think that part of why this is such an important conversation is that we've got to be about succession planning and about building our bench at the same time that we've got to be about asserting our value, worth, and power in the sector. And that's a pretty challenging thing to balance. But at any rate, we are interested in this, and certainly do not feel like we've got it figured out, but are interested in what are the differences in the career paths and the career models, and how does that make a difference to this pay equity issue. I mentioned the departing to you. This is another slide that shows that nonprofit professionals reported that about a third of them think they will stay actively in a program responsibility in a nonprofit. We are going to have a lot of consultants. I've been a consultant for a long time, and we are going to have lots of competition because just about every executive director I know who thinks she's about to retire is also planning to hang out her shingle as a consultant. So all of you all who are in the market for consultants, it's going to be boom times for you. About 16% hope that they can do something about giving money away. Many of them have been petitioning for money for years, and now they hope they're going to have a chance to influence the thinking of philanthropists. And only about 8% think they want to go to work in a nonprofit. In a for-profit field. So this is an interesting set of information as we think about the next 10 to 15 years, what people's aspirations are and how they see their lives unfolding. Now I'm going to talk to you about, I think, what is the most important thing I have to say to you today. And that is the role of the board of directors. So I talked to you about the slide that showed that women board chairs do not champion other women as professionals in there. And we talked about the fact that male board chairs did champion nonprofit people and help them advise. And as I did my conversations with my 66 people, many of the women reported to me that their mentors were men. Many of them found that the men in their lives had been the ones that had really helped them grow and develop and had given them that confidence that we have been discussing. So once again, this is not a war of the sexes. This is a much more nuanced conversation. But the conversation comes back to the boardroom, because who sets the salaries? Who approves the salary administration plan? Who struggles to see what kinds of raises or bonuses can be given in a lean year? It ultimately is the board of directors. Now, I have argued hard with many of my executive director clients who have said that she did not want to propose raises, certainly not a big raise for herself, and without equal raises for others. And she was saying that because she didn't want to have to raise additional dollars because she was worried she couldn't. And so I understand that. But I say to those women, and if those are any of you in this room, by keeping your salary artificially low, you are crippling the future of your organization. That you must have an adequate salary in the budget, so that if you get called by the White House to come and serve, or whatever marvelous thing could happen to you, you can leave and they can hire somebody who can be even a patch on what you've been for that organization. And I say to them, if you're worried about raising the money, give it back to the organization as a major donor, but get your name on the wall. How's that? Instead of quietly sacrificing every single day by having an inadequate salary. But there's a lot in this conversation about the executive's role in setting salaries and the board's role in setting salaries. And I am not arguing for micromanagement, but I am arguing for true attention. There must be attention paid to the way in which salaries are set, people are evaluated, and expectations are created in that regard. So another study. Daring to Lead is done every 5 years by Compass Point. They survey 3,000 nonprofit execs across the country. A lot of interesting stuff in that. I commend it to you, daringtolead.org, because one of the things they ask of the executive directors is how many hours a month do you spend in conversation with your board members? And a shockingly large percentage spend less than 5 hours a month talking to their board. Now, if we're not going to talk to them, we can't expect them to understand what business we're in, and we can't expect them to be good at this piece, which is performance evaluation. So performance evaluation, there's dialogue around whether a performance evaluation is good or not, but some means of measuring performance must occur if pay is going to be equitable. There has to be criteria set about what matters and how successful we have been in order to justify pay increases. In this study of 3,000 nonprofit execs, 45% received no performance evaluation at all. And of the 55%, so this is the next slide, of the 55% who did have some form, less than 20% felt it was useful. So when, again, in my career, as I've asked people how this occurs, they say things to me rather often. Oh yes, once a year I have lunch with my board chair and he tells me I've done a good job. Well, that's nice, but that's not professional development, and that's not a path for pay equity, and that hardly opens the door for a real conversation about the way we do our business here and how we keep and attract talent to this organization. So the issues around HR, and once again, those of you who are leading nonprofits are thinking, you large enthusiastic woman, please do not encourage my board to get in my business. I got it. But there's a confidence issue here too. You know your business, and you know what matters, and you know your staff. What needs to happen is better articulation of success, clarity around goals and measurements, and an ability to discuss it in a dispassionate way that doesn't have somebody's first name attached to the conversation. So this is really important, that we have got to own the fact that unless we somehow get better HR practices in our nonprofit organizations, we will never see pay equity. And that is my belief, because there is an intimate connection between whether or not we're able to talk about what we do and why we do it and how we do it well and how we are compensated for it. So you've heard me say that there are 3 key questions, and I would like to just review those for you as we go forward. The questions are, how can we assure young nonprofit professional women and men have opportunity for increased responsibility and leadership roles? How are older nonprofit professional women going to retool their careers and eventually retire with dignity? And how can we strengthen the board's sense of responsibility to their employees? I started out by saying to you, it is absolutely a mission of mine that boards will own the idea that how people are treated inside that organization is a valuable and important measurement of their success, and that they will aspire to see that people are treated as well as they aspire to treat those they serve with their mission-related activities. So that's kind of the nut of it. How do we strengthen the board's sense of responsibility as employers as well as champions of our missions? So let me tell you a little bit about our results, because I'm very hopeful that this is going to go on here and that you all are going to show us stuff we didn't know, and you're going to do all kinds of great things that we haven't thought of. But let me tell you a few things that we've thought of. So since August of 2008, when I had a picnic at my house and asked 25 women I respected in the nonprofit sector, do we have a problem with pay equity? And by the end of that picnic, we were sure we did. Since that time, we have done more than 30 different classes and convenings on this topic, from negotiation to HR practices to legal responsibilities of boards across the spectrum, different ones. And in those 30 classes and different kinds of convenings, we had 2,500 participants. Now, I neglected to mention to you all at the beginning a key part of our work, and that is we have a kitchen cabinet. You'll see it in all of the publications. We set out with the intention of building a movement, not just raising an issue. And we have 165 people in the Pittsburgh region. They are academics, they're nonprofit leaders, they're foundation leaders, they're business and corporate leaders, they're women, they're men. They're people who have signed up to say, I am allied with this issue, I am concerned about this issue, and I intend to take it on. So the 2,500 participants in many cases are members of our kitchen cabinet who have come to hear national speakers, they have come to review our research, they've come to be skeptics that were family in our family, to say what was wrong with our thinking. They have helped us get press and publicity. They have brought us to their organizations. They have used our slideshows to show what we're doing, and nothing gives me greater joy than when a woman walks up to me and says, my board chair heard this, she talked to the board, and I got a raise. So convenings and conversation, 2,500. I've been mentioning to you about the research that we've done, the 990 research, focus groups, interviews. We did an online survey about attitudes towards employment in nonprofit. We had 1,500 participants in our research that all has informed what I've been presenting. And then this is something that I really love, and if we're building a movement, I think it's really important. And that is that we have had 25 different articles, radio shows, different kinds of press coverage about this specific issue. And my co-chair is Rebecca LaCour of Bayer USA. She's the chief of staff there at Bayer. And she started out in communications, and she told me how you do media impressions. So the way you do media impressions, some of you all may know this, but you take the article and the publication and the day of the week that it was published, because there's different circulation on different days of the week, and you multiply the number of articles times the circulation, and that generates the media impressions. Obviously, nobody reads the whole paper every day, but we don't have a way to tell what percentage of people read that. So the media impressions is assuming that everybody saw it in one way or another. We have had 2.5 million media impressions about the 74% article in our region. And we have taken this issue out of the ladies' room and into the boardroom, and I am delighted to be able to say that to you. So, what's next? Sunday, my kids tease me and say what I've just read is always the best thing. But Sunday in the New York Times, some of you all may have seen an article by Sheryl Sandberg and a man named Adam Grant, who's at the Wharton School, talking about when talking about bias backfires. So one of the things that is really interesting to me is how do we take this forward and how do we make change? Alma asked me if we're going to recommend a law, and there has been equal pay legislation introduced by Erin Mulchaney of Pittsburgh, PA, in the state legislature, and it didn't go anywhere. But yes, there is ongoing work to see that it becomes a law. The other thing that was really interesting to me about that was that they linked with the Women's Law Project, and they have dramatically shown that pay equity is a health issue for women, and that it profoundly affects women's stress levels and a multitude of other ways. And so we need to put this issue into not only an economic issue, but also a health issue. So I do think that if you've got advocacy aspirations, you go, girl, and you try to make it happen. But this is a little hopeful thing that I got in last Sunday's New York Times that I think each one of us can do. Remember, I asked you to be thinking what each one of you can do. So encouraging people to correct for biases does more than change the way we view others. It also affects the opportunities women will seek for themselves. One of us, Adam, presented data in his classes at Wharton on the underrepresentation of women in major leadership roles and discussed the factors that held women back. He thought a public dialogue would prompt action. But during the next 5 months, there was no change in the percentage of female MBA students who applied for a leadership position on campus. The following year, he shared the same data about the shortage of female leaders with one sentence added to the end. I don't want to see this ever happen again. During the next 5 months, there was a 65% increase in the number of female MBA students who sought out leadership roles compared to those who had in the previous year. And female students who heard this statement were 53% more likely to apply for leadership positions than those who did not hear it that year. To motivate women at work, we need to be explicit about our disapproval of the leadership imbalance as well as our support of female leaders. When more women lead, performance improves. Startups led by women are more likely to succeed, innovative firms with more women in top management are more profitable, and companies with gender diversity have more revenue, customers, market share, and profits. A comparative analysis of 95 studies on gender differences showed that when it came to leadership skills, although men were more confident, women are more competent. To break down the barriers that hold women back, it is not enough to spread awareness. If we don't reinforce that people need and want to overcome their biases, we end up silently condoning the status quo. So let's be clear. We want these biases to vanish, and we know you do too. So it matters that we talk about it. It matters that the conversation goes on, but not as a woman as victim, not as an oh, poor me, but as a we know that the way our society works best is when it's fair. And when we feel like we can hold our heads up high and proud because we're doing right by the people inside our organizations and the people we serve. We are planning in our part of the world to have a great debate on Pay Equity Day, which is April the 14th. It takes us until April the 14th to make as much money as men. But we're going to have a great debate, a formal debate, where we're going to be trying to probe for why is this still true in 2015, and how can we better change the world in favor of equity. I leave you with two things. This is one of my very favorite quotes. It's by Seamus Haney. And it says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history can rhyme. Sisters and brothers, I believe that this is that time that we can make hope and history rhyme. And one more bit of research. Could I ask everyone in the room to stand and assume the Wonder Woman position? If we stand like this for 2 minutes, we will be infinitely more confident that this is going to change. Thank you all so much.